Welcome back to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm a professor at McGill University and currently the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology. For this session, we're going to talk a little bit about the What Works Clearinghouse, which is from the U.S. It just occurred to me now that What Works Clearinghouse is from the Department of Education in the U.S., which is a cabinet position and an entire infrastructure that the current president has said he's going to get rid of. I hope he doesn't get rid of What Works Clearinghouse, because it's a very strong component from the Institute of Educational Sciences, which is part of the Department of Education. And What Works Clearinghouse is an excellent place to start when you're looking for some educational interventions that have strong and consistent research support. Now, I always talk about why not use What Works Clearinghouse or where it falls apart. But yeah, there's some weaknesses with it. However, it is an outstanding place to find research that meets specific standards of quality for being applied to classrooms. There's also application information in there too. For a while, I used to have a lot of reservations with the research because it didn't talk very much about implementation. But now there's quite a bit about implementation of practices, how it affects policy, how research can really be positive. So the What Works Clearinghouse is a positive idea and has excellent resources. That's actually one of my first go-tos when there's an educational intervention that I'm not sure if it's effective, but I'll look on What Works Clearinghouse first. So it's excellent. But like a lot of really good places, it's not sufficient. It is outstanding, and it does what it does well. I'm not saying it needs to change dramatically, but as a clinician or as somebody looking for the research that is the most relevant, it's one step among many. First of all, most of the research still sticks in that proof of concept stage. In other words, there's experimental studies that work on a specific group of kids. And the What Works Clearinghouse is fantastic. However, what it doesn't say is when it works, for whom it works, how it works, and why it works. It also doesn't indicate the robustness. In other words, in this robustness doesn't mean the strength of a finding. The strength of an outcome can be robust, but there's a different definition that I've used a lot in implementation, which is how much can you change the intervention, or how much can you change it and it still be effective. That's a little different from the robustness that usually is consistency of findings over time. But let's get back to the other questions that we ask. What works? Truly important. There's no question. But when it works, it does talk a little bit about grade level of when an intervention has been tried out. It doesn't say too much about when the best time to try it is, what the best grade is it for. It only talks about what's there, which, to be fair, that's okay. It's an amalgamation site of putting things together and giving them a consistent evaluative look. And so it can only take in the research that's done. Although, to be fair, again, they do give guidelines for people doing intervention research in education that they should follow in order for What Works Clearinghouse to do a good job of intervention. Nonetheless, the developmental level of each intervention is critically important and really hard to get exact information from this site. So when? For what group? I don't think most interventions generalize that well across age groups. Some do, many don't. So it's important to know, is the child or the policy or the individual that you are working on as a clinician, or the theory that you're developing, is the data from this intervention study or series of intervention study, is it consistent with what you're looking for? The second one is who you're looking for. Now, I'm not like a lot of folks who seem to think that certain ethnic groups are fundamentally and qualitatively different than others. Most programs work fairly well across groups, but it is really important to know who it's effective for. Is it more effective for children with learning disabilities, for children from high income versus low income, children who have a history of academic failure versus those with academic success, people with concurrent mental health issues. For whom is this designed, and for whom is it most effective? This is a really important area. It's especially important if we're trying to go across cultures, across languages. And even it's not insignificant to look across ethnic groups, but there's a lot more in common than different. So you need to look, you need to investigate, and make sure that the population that the proof of concept has been tried on is close, or you have reason to believe it would generalize to the population that you are working with. So that's a really hard one. You certainly want a diverse group in the sample size of the research you're evaluating. What Works Clearinghouse does indicate that. However, they just say what it is. They don't make a judgment on it. You're going to have to make a judgment on it as you're trying to implement any of these interventions. And of course, I always make the case that what works is awesome, but how it works is better. How do you implement it? How do you make it work in a classroom? How do you make it work in a tutoring session, a special education? This is an American website, so they focus heavily on multi-tier student supports as opposed to making diagnoses or placements that work. So that's kind of helpful because you do have the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They often call them low-intensity interventions for like tier 1 and some tier 2. And then they have other things for more high intensity. That tends to be how they differentiate. But they also give practice ideas on how you can implement this best based on the literature they have. But the truth is, again, it's an amalgamation site of other research studies. Most research studies do not report in enough detail what exactly are the methodologies, what are the variations in methodologies that can be effective, how can it be done in a certain curriculum in a certain environment. Honestly, that's not really the purpose of most published research, but if it's going to be relevant, it should be. I always know, and I am well aware that when you start saying should or must or what people need without something else supporting that, you're really just making an emotional cry. You're not really doing things. I'm going to just tell you straight out, I think it should say how to do things, at least in supplemental materials of what are some of the aspects of how you implement it. And I've talked about this before with things like what are the resources, training, time, energy, personnel, materials, what are all those components that you have to have. So what works is fine, how it works is equally fine. Now, why something works is I guess I'll just say it's I don't want to say optional, that sounds bad, but the truth is we have a lot of things in medicine and education and psychology that are very effective, and we have no earthly clue why. That's fine, that can work. I don't mind that. But as I mentioned before, when we talked about the open source analogy model, one of the ways you can be flexible with things is because you know why things work. You have a theory behind them, and then you know which parts of the theory are a kernel or core that can't be changed and which parts are more peripheral and can easily be changed. So knowing why isn't 100% critical, but I've made the case before that theory and models are critical. Theory and models are what we mean when we start talking about why something works. Yes, I understand. We have a lot of stuff we do, no clue why it works, but it does, and I'm all for that. If you just wear a clown costume and spin around and do whirly-whirlies and that makes a kid read better, I'm all in. Let's do it. But if there's any possibility to know why something works, that really adds a lot to what works. So the theory and models are important. I just don't want to dismiss that, but I do understand that many times in this sort of work, we have no clue why things work. But it is important to remember that what is important, but when, who, how, and why are just as important. And if we're going to have relevant research, we need to consider those 4 other questions. And all of this leads to this robustness. Is this a strong intervention that works across the board for everyone? Is this specific for some kids? Who does it work for at what time, in what situation? How can we implement it in the right way? And why the heck does this work? So we know more detail about when to use it. These are important. What Works Clearinghouse, I was actually, when I first put this topic in my queue of topics I wanted to talk about for research relevant, I was actually really negative about What Works Clearinghouse, because they did just have what works with a set criteria, and it's a solid criteria, but that was it. But I looked at it again, and it is much, much different, much, much better. Focuses on policy, focuses on how teachers can do these things in their practice. I'm finding it's pretty good, but still, they can't create a good website that's an amalgamation of research, when in fact the research itself, the raw materials they're working with, just don't have this information. So do think about that when you put things together. What Works is awesome. It's so much better than Pinterest. By the way, you do know that's someone did a lot of studies on that, and where teachers find their intervention ideas, even though they claim to be people who practice evidence-based practices, most teachers, the number one place they get information from is Pinterest. And obviously there's no evaluative component on that. It just sort of looks cool. There's also Teachers Pay Teachers, which is teachers will put up curriculum and ideas. Other teachers will pay for it, which is a pretty cool thing. That's another one. Facebook is another one. Other social media sites are other things. So people don't tend to go to What Works Clearinghouse first. They're more likely to go to Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers. So I would strongly recommend we start with What Works Clearinghouse if we're going to do evidence-based practices. But this is very much like when I criticize scholarly journals. Teachers, educators, psychologists, policymakers don't tend to read scholarly journals because they find them irrelevant. Pinterest, Teachers Pay Teachers, I think that's what it's called. I'm pretty sure it is. I should have looked that up before I mentioned it. But the teacher sharing of ideas site, Pinterest, Facebook, other social media sources are convenient, easy to work through. They're compelling. Whereas What Works Clearinghouse is evidence-based, but it's not quite as compelling and as relevant, and certainly doesn't answer the 4 questions of, we know what works, but we don't know when, who, how, and why. And I do say, when you look at Pinterest, it is very clear in many cases how you do the thing. What's not clear is the background. Is it going to work? Do we have a proof of concept that's been repeated over again? Or do we just have something that looks flashy, something that looks really cool, or something that one teacher, one place finds it works for their kids, and they don't even know if it works? It may just be that children enjoy the work. Satisfaction or enjoyment is not really an outcome measure that we're looking for. It is an important measure, because if kids like what you're doing and if teachers enjoy teaching in a certain style, they'll keep using it, which is really important. But this is very much like a medicine that tastes bad versus a medicine that tastes good. Of course you want it to taste good, but the most important thing is that it works. And so that's where What Works Clearinghouse is a fine approach, but do consider it the starting point. And what I would actually look for is What Works Clearinghouse for information, and then see if it's on Pinterest to use, or Teachers Pay Teachers. Probably not. But if it's on one of those sites too, then you've got the best of the combo pizza. But what works, critically important. When, who, how, why, equally as important. So I hope if we're going to have an evidence-based practice, we consider What Works Clearinghouse a starting point. And I really hope the new White House administration in the United States does not follow through on their promise to get rid of the Department of Education, because it would be a shame for teachers to lose this very important resource. Thanks very much, and we'll talk again on building research relevance.